I wasn't aware that there was a delay, but it does make sense because there's certain foods that I used to eat, like Pringles and snacks and crisps and things like that, where I feel like I could eat two tubes of the thing before my body even realized what was going on. And are they in some way designed to encourage that speed of eating? And
So there are many people who will say the food industry has specifically designed these to make them, firstly, what we call hyperpalatable. So to have the right mix of fat, sugar, carbohydrate, etc., to make them really tasty, and in this case, salt as well. I don't think the food industry is out there to get us. I think that what the food industry were doing 50 years ago versus what they're doing now is quite different. But some people will say I'm very naive. I do believe the food industry ultimately want to produce food that's safe but also healthy for us. That's probably an unpopular opinion, but based on my interactions with the food industry, I believe that. However, I do believe that these crisps have been made to be flavoursome, to be palatable to you, so that you do enjoy them. Now, whether that's that you then go and overeat them, I think is, yes, a byproduct of that. Now, it doesn't take 20 minutes for all of the fullness signals to kick in, because as soon as you start chewing something, you start to release different hormones, and different sensory characteristics of the food will also trigger some sort of fullness. But what we do know is that you have more of these fullness receptors saying, hey, you're full, lower down in your gastrointestinal tract. And so if you can get food to the lower gastrointestinal tract, that's when it says, hey, Stephen, you're full now. And these heavily processed snacks that you've got here would be typically absorbed higher up the gastrointestinal tract, because kind of the hard work's been done. And yet when you've got something like a whole grain or a nut, typically that would be absorbed lower down the gastrointestinal tract, where you've got more of these fullness signals, so giving you that greater feeling of fullness.
My girlfriend has said to me for many, many a year that I need to eat slower.
Yep.
And I thought it was like a spiritual thing that she's into, to do with like giving the food gratitude, et cetera, et cetera. But upon reading your work and having this conversation today, now I'm starting to believe that she was right all along, unsurprisingly, once again, and that there is a scientific basis for slowing down how fast I eat.
Absolutely. We now know that eating rate's important. There's some fantastic work that's being done by a Professor Kieran Ford, who's dedicated many years into researching this and looking at how changing the structure and texture of a food can modulate your eating rate, and how also your eating rate can modulate how you metabolize the food and how many calories you go on to eat. And so it's a great example. I talked about all of these different pieces of the puzzle. That's one of those pieces. So when we talk about how you eat, changing your eating rate, so how quickly you have your breakfast, your lunch, your dinner, or any of these snacks, will also, without you consciously thinking about it, change how many calories you eat, might change how quickly you metabolize the food as well.
What's the sort of knock-on effects there?
So the research that's been done by Kieran Ford shows that on average, if you change the speed in which you eat your food by about 20%, you reduce your calorie intake by about 15%. And that's due to where you're releasing your hunger hormones, how many fullness hormones you're releasing, etc. So it's a really simple strategy. And we see this play out as well, even in our own evidence, when we look in our Zoe Predict studies at fast eaters versus slow eaters. We see that once we adjust for lots of other confounders, there's a difference of 120 calories between what fast eaters have over a day versus slow eaters, with the fast eaters eating more calories compared to slow eaters. And there's even been clinical trials where they get groups of individuals and say, okay, slow down the rate at which you eat your food over the next, 3, 4, 5 weeks. They have another group, they say, just eat at your normal rate. Those people who are intentionally slowing down the rate at which they eat their food lose more weight than those people who continue to eat at their normal rate.
See, I always made this like weird, unfounded evolutionary argument to her. I was like, well, in the wild, you got to eat what you can. So people eat quick, but we're not in the wild anymore, and the food choices that we have are drastically different now. So
yeah, and also the food that is available to many of us is the kind of food that can be eaten really quickly. So there's some great research that's been conducted that shows that heavily processed, soft textured type food can be eaten 50% more quickly than the unprocessed, harder textured equivalent. So the kind of food that we're eating now is quite different. So you're eating it really quickly. You're overeating because your hunger signals haven't got there, but it's that rate at which you're eating.
What's an example of a soft textured food versus like a hard textured food?
So we can use an example from a study that was actually conducted in 1977, and this was published in The Lancet. It was one of the first nutrition studies published in The Lancet. And it's one of the first studies to show the importance of the food matrix. And it kind of got buried for many years. And it's a study by the scientist called Haber, where he fed individuals whole apples. Mm-hmm. He fed individuals the equivalent amount of carbohydrate from apple puree. It was exactly the same, i.e., same nutrients, same fibre, same everything else in it. All that's different is the apples are hard, the puree is soft. And what he found was that those people who were given the puree, even though they were given exactly the same amount of calories, ate that puree, or rather drank that puree, 3 to 4 times more quickly than when they had the apples, the equivalent amount of calories. So they were eating the same amount of calories, but 3 to 4 times more quickly.
That's like 300%, 400% faster. Okay.
They felt less full. So when they measured their fullness, and they monitored that for quite a few hours, so going up to quite a few hours, those that were having the apples continued to feel full for longer. Those that were having the puree didn't feel full as long. And what also happened, interestingly, is those that were having the puree had what we call a blood sugar dip. So about 2 to 4 hours after having a high carbohydrate meal, we know that some people have a dip in their circulating blood sugar. And we know from our own Zoe Predict research that actually this can really increase your hunger levels.
Yeah.
And so we know from our research, if you are a dipper, I'm a dipper, hence I get hangry quite often. So in about 2 hours, I'm going to be eating one of these. If you're a dipper, you know, your blood glucose is going below your baseline levels. And so you get hungry, you go on to eat 180 calories on average more at your next meal because of that. And so, I mean, this research from 1977, I think is fascinating. It's that first research really demonstrating the importance of food matrix. And then since then, I've now, over the last 10 years, done lots of studies with nuts, with oats, for example, that demonstrate you can have 2 foods that have identical back-of-pack labelling, identical nutrients, identical calorie value, if you were to look at the back-of-pack labelling, but can have entirely different impacts in terms of how much energy you absorb, how you metabolize that food, how it impacts your hunger, how it impacts downstream health effects.
And you've done some research on walnuts, right?
So we've done work on walnuts,
Almonds.
but particularly on almonds.